The Middle Passage of the transatlantic slave trade was the appalling international conduit by which 10 to 15 million Africans were violently forced from their homelands and into slavery in the Americas. Altogether, at least 2 million Africans lost their lives on the journey. Once Africans were taken captive, they underwent a series of processes that suppressed, dehumanized, and ultimately commodified their existences, both on the ship and on the plantation. Aboard the slave ships, African captives were often isolated from their cultures, families, packed into inhumane conditions, and generally treated like cargo.
The shocking depravity of the slave ships and the hopelessness of the slaves' situation ostensibly would have resulted in a high rate of slave resistance. But in fact, of the 36,002 voyages recorded in the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, there are only 483 recorded revolts. As historian David Eltis contends, successful rebellions were quite rare, so that the great majority of revolts were suppressed with the vessel remaining under the control of the original owner.
The infrequency of captive insurrection during the Middle Passage can be attributed to the uniquely destabilizing phenomenon of the slave ship itself. The unfamiliarity of the naval atmosphere, the physical and ideological power dynamics enforced by captains, and the forced enclosure all added up to a powerful technology of commodification.
Our project, The Anatomy of a Slave Ship, argues that the structure of the slave ship itself contributed to the infrequency of slave insurrection by examining both the vessel's suppressive technologies and the ways in which they adapted to more effectively quell any and all forms of slave resistance. To exhibit our work, we decided to construct a model of the slave ship in order to emphasize the boat's physical elements. We have placed markers with the numbers indicating the specific parts of the ship that we discuss in a booklet.
A fear of insurrection was inculcated in slaves on the decks of slave ships. If any word of an impending mutiny made its way to the slavers, captains would often make public displays of the attempted conspirators by decapitating them and amputating their bodies on the deck for other captives to observe. Conversely, captains would reward informants in front of all the other captives with prizes including new money, clothing, or even emancipation. Moreover, captains would put on other public displays of power on the deck to discourage insurrection. Captain William Snellgrave reportedly had his sentries fire their guns at the slaves' evening meal to prevent insurrection. It would have been difficult for slaves to entertain the prospect of an insurrection when they did not feel as though they could trust even their fellow captives, especially if they were unable to communicate with each other due to lingual or cultural barriers. Slavers along the Middle Passage used a combination of psychological intimidation and physical restraints to overpower and demoralize their captives and, by undermining a facet of the captive's agency, further the process of commodification.
The increase in slave revolts meant that slave ship owners began to take preventative steps. These steps were seen as necessary for the ship owners in order to prevent a loss of their commodities, i.e., to prevent high mortality rates of slaves on board their ships. These preventative steps took many forms, but one of the most significant was the sudden presence of guns on board the ships. Ship owners acquired large amounts of firearms, swivel guns, and cannon, and extra crew to supervise slaves. The guns were almost constantly in the possession of or near the ship crew, as the crew were extremely distrusting of the slaves and believed that a piece of wood, a tool, or any physical object carelessly left within a slave's reach could become a weapon. Because the ship crew were extremely wary of the potential dangers of an insurrection, the slave ships were designed to give the crew vantage points to bring their weaponry to play against the Africans. The constant sight of weaponry greatly affected the slaves' entire voyage and their likelihood to participate in a rebellion because the guns instilled constant fear. This meant that they were an effective tool for the crew and captain to extinguish any thoughts of rebellion amongst the slaves. One of the most symbolic aspects of the entire slave trade was the image of chains and shackles. While the chains physically kept the slaves as captives by holding them in the cargo hold or restraining them while on deck, the chains also mentally kept the slaves in captivity because of the basic lack of freedom that they represented. Chains were used in similar ways as the guns in order to give power to the ship crew and captain, who were greatly outnumbered by the slaves. The chains were a unique form of oppression of the slaves because, unlike the confines of the cargo hold or the horrors that occurred on the deck, the chains traveled everywhere with the slaves and were present throughout their entire time on board the ships.
The cargo hold, one of the major parts of the vessel, plays a significant role in the life of a captive aboard a ship traveling across the Atlantic. In addition to the space being suffocatingly small, hundreds of bodies were forced to coexist despite the horrendous conditions. Due to their destabilized state, oftentimes the cargo hold served as a great mystery for the captives, as they weren't able to know why they were there, where they were going, and how much time they had spent on the ship. Since captives had no sense of the directionality and the length of their journey, the cargo hold could feel like a destination within itself, and it destabilized the mind of the captive. This lack of community and safety aboard the ship would encourage captives to regain control of their bodies, which meant that the cargo hold would be a place in which captives could conspire against the crewmen with hopes of overthrowing the captain and gaining control of the vessel, despite the looming possibility of death or abuse. However, over time, the cargo hold grew in size as slave traders realized that they could transport more slaves with the hopes of making a bigger profit. Consequently, the conditions of the cargo hold would worsen, and slaves would become more prone to form rebellions. Slave revolts were a way for slaves to attempt to take control of their bodies and interrupt their own process of commodification.
The idea of living at sea was completely unfamiliar to captives who had never before encountered the ocean as a human domain. On top of the terror and uncertainty of capture, sale, and all the other inhumane processes the slaves are subjected to prior to embarkation, they were also now thrust into a seemingly unlivable environment. The journey itself was also incredibly destabilizing, as time and location were never readily definable. Time was lived in motion, but at no discernible rhythm by which Africans could orient their movement in time or readily measure time's passage. Existing on open ocean presented other cultural challenges for captives as well, including subverting their relationship to death and dying. Earth, the most integral element of the burial process, was inaccessible at sea. Lacking the materials necessary for proper burial ceremony meant that the process of death, as understood by slaves, would remain incomplete. Yet some slaves nevertheless chose to take their fate into their own hands, and so slavers began to adapt to these suicide attempts by adding nets to the sides of the slave ships. Thus, the very environment of the Middle Passage was a unique tool of disorientation and disarmament employed against captives. This sense of fear and inexperience likely prevented many slaves from attempting any kind of insurrection. Furthermore, the impossibility of formal burial and mourning rituals for deceased captives meant even death was inaccessible. Historians have contended that slave resistance is arguably the most understudied area of slave trade studies. Insurrections aboard slave ships have largely been ignored in the history of the Atlantic slave trade due to the scarcity of hard data and documentation of any such events. However, attempting to reconstruct the lives and experiences of captives along the Middle Passage necessitates a consideration of why, faced with dismal conditions and no foreseeable end, most captives did not resist. Although each and every voyage was unique in terms of its combination of crew members, slaves, and circumstances, one of the only consistent elements in the Middle Passage was the structure of the slave ship and its evolution over time in response to the threat of rebellion. Thus, the environment itself must be considered a factor in the ability and willingness of slaves to rebel. As a singularly incapacitating experience that both corporeally and ideologically challenged captives' selfhood, the slave ship was arguably the best deterrent of insurrection. In investigating the question of slave revolt, it is nevertheless important to keep in mind the possibility that modern conceptions of freedom have skewed our interpretations of resistance. The impossibility of representing the captive experience through media as limited as the archives prevents us from ever entirely understanding what insurrection meant to those who attempted or did not attempt it. Furthermore, the search for resistance inherent in research like ours is potentially a flawed endeavor, a result of projecting our implicit assumptions about revolt onto an inscrutable past.